The rain came down in sheets, turning the hard-packed earth of Alaric's farmyard into a slick of black sludge. It was a cold, mean rain for this late in the season, the kind that promised an early and bitter winter. He stood under the narrow overhang of his barn, the scent of wet pine, cold mud, and the sharp bite of wood smoke from his cottage chimney filling his senses. He had just finished securing the last of the shutters on the barn, his knuckles raw and red from the wind. This was his life, a repeating cycle of chores dictated by the turning of the earth and the whims of the sky. He was not a young man, but not yet old. The lines on his face were carved more by solitude than by years. His world was small, contained by the split-rail fence that marked the edge of his property and the jagged line of the broken tusk foothills that loomed to the north. It was a life he had not chosen but had accepted, the way a stone accepts the slow grinding of a river. He had lost his wife and daughter to the red cough a decade ago, and with them any desire for the company of towns or the noise of other people. Here, the silence was a companion, and the work was a prayer. That was when he saw it. A flicker of movement by the north fence line, where his small patch of tilled earth met the wild woods. It was a figure, stumbling, lurching through the downpour. At first he thought it was a deer, wounded by a hunter. But it was too large, too upright. The figure reached his fence, one hand gripping the top rail as if it were the last solid thing in a collapsing world. And then it fell. It did not crumple. It fell like a felled tree, straight and heavy, landing in the mud just outside his land. Alaric's hand went to the hatchet tucked in his belt, a reflex. The foothills were not empty. Orcs lived up there. Not the marauding bands that legends spoke of, but clans that kept to themselves, trading pelts for iron goods at the crossroads twice a year. Still, an orc on his land, or just outside it, was trouble. He stayed under the cover of the barn roof, watching. The rain hammered down on the fallen shape, plastering dark hair to a broad, green-skinned back. An orc, yes. A female by the build of her. She was wearing piecemeal leather and what looked like dented steel pauldrons. She wasn't moving. Every instinct screamed at him to go inside, bar the door, and wait for morning. This was not his fight. This was not his business. His world was small for a reason. It was safe. He had made it safe through years of deliberate, lonely effort. Introducing an injured orc into that equation was like throwing a lit torch into a hayloft. He watched for a full minute, the wind whipping rain into his face. Then he saw them. Torches. 3 of them, maybe 4, weaving through the trees high up on the slope, descending. They were searching, hunting, and the fallen figure by his fence was their quarry. He looked at the orc woman, a dark heap in the mud. He looked at the approaching lights. He thought of his quiet cottage, the warm hearth, the simple meal waiting on his table. All of it was balanced on a knife's edge. He could let them find her. They would finish their business and move on. By morning, it would be as if nothing had happened. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. But then he remembered the way she had fallen. Not with the weakness of the sick, but with the final, spent effort of the hunted. He remembered the rigid set of her shoulders even in collapse, a posture of defiance to the very last. Something in that resonated with a part of him he thought had died with his family, the part that did not simply endure, but stood against the storm. Something told him to carry her in. He did not know where the thought came from. It was not a voice, not a feeling, just a simple, undeniable certainty. It was a terrible idea, a foolish, reckless, world-breaking idea. He did it anyway. Leaving the relative shelter of the barn, Alaric pulled his collar up against the driving rain and trudged across the yard. The mud sucked at his boots. Each step was a conscious decision. He reached the fence and vaulted it, his worn leather trousers soaking through instantly. Up close, she was larger than he had thought, taller than him by a head, with the powerful build of a warrior. A deep gash ran from her shoulder down her back, ugly and black with congealing blood. An arrow was broken off in her thigh, the fletching slick and dark. He could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face, even slack as it was. Her tusks were short but sharp, jutting from her lower lip. One of her hands was clenched into a fist, knuckles white. He hesitated for only a second. The torches were closer now, their light glinting off the wet leaves. He holstered his hatchet, bent down, and slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, the other under her back. He grunted with the effort. She was heavy, dense with muscle, and slick with rain and blood. He staggered to his feet, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her breath was a faint, warm puff against his neck. He turned his back on the hunting party and carried her toward his home. Each step was a betrayal of the quiet life he had so carefully built. The gate whined in protest as he nudged it open with his hip. The warm, yellow light of his cottage window seemed like a beacon from another world, a world of peace he was now dragging into a war. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, letting the storm slam it shut behind them. The small room was filled with the smell of stew and burning oak. He laid her down gently on the packed dirt floor in front of the hearth, the firelight playing over her green skin and the dark, angry lines of her wounds. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, rain and mud dripping from him onto the floor stones. What have I done? The question was a cold stone in his gut. He had brought the wilderness into his home. He had brought violence to his hearth. He looked down at the unconscious orc, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. There was no taking it back. The fence was crossed. The door was opened. He went to the basin, washed the mud and blood from his hands, and began to work. He fetched his leather-working needles, the strong gut thread he used for harnesses, and the bottle of bitter-smelling antiseptic he made from gallow root. He stoked the fire, put a kettle on to boil, and tore clean linen into strips. This was what he knew: mending things, fixing what was broken. He just had not ever tried to mend something that could, upon waking, tear him limb from limb. He started with the arrow in her thigh. He cut away the leather of her trousers, his knife careful and precise. The muscle was swollen and dark around the shaft. He took a deep breath, gripped the broken wood and pulled. It came free with a sickening sound, followed by a fresh surge of blood. The orc woman groaned, a low, guttural sound, but did not wake. Alaric worked quickly, cleaning the wound, packing it with a poultice of mashed herbs, and binding it tight. The gash on her back was worse. It was long and deep, a sword cut by the look of it. It would need stitching. He knelt beside her, the heat from the fire warming his face. As he cleaned the edges of the wound, her eyes snapped open. They were not brown or blue. They were the colour of amber, fierce and intelligent. They fixed on him, not with confusion, but with pure, undiluted hostility. Her hand, the one that had been clenched in a fist, shot out and locked around his wrist. Her grip was like iron, fast, brutal, even dying. She could kill him. The thought was calm, factual. "Go ahead," he said, his voice quiet, rough from disuse. He did not struggle. He did not even flinch. He simply met her gaze and held the blood-soaked rag in his other hand. Her eyes narrowed. She studied his face, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the plain, homespun cloth of his tunic, the calloused, steady hand that held the needle. She was looking for the trick, the angle, the price. He knew that look. It was the look of a creature that had never known kindness without a cost. He just waited. The fire crackled. The rain beat against the roof. Her grip was a manacle on his wrist, her thumb pressing hard against the pulse point. She could feel the steady, unhurried beat of his heart. Slowly, deliberately, the pressure eased. Her fingers uncurled. Her hand fell away, landing limply on the floor. Her eyes, however, did not leave his. They watched him, sharp and wary, as he picked up the needle and thread. "This will hurt," he said simply. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Her jaw was tight. He began to stitch the wound. His movements were practiced and efficient, the same movements he used to repair a saddle or a torn wineskin. He worked in silence, acutely aware of her gaze on him. He could feel her pain in the subtle tensing of her muscles, but she made no sound. She just lay there, on the floor of his home, and let a strange human sew her back together. When he was done, he covered the stitches with a clean bandage and gently draped a worn wool blanket over her. He rose, his knees cracking, and went to the hearth. He ladled some of the stew into a wooden bowl. It was simple fare, just root vegetables and a bit of salted rabbit, but it was hot. He brought it to her, along with a cup of water. He set them on the floor beside her head. He did not try to help her sit up. He did not urge her to eat. He just provided. "Why?" Her voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was the first word she had spoken to him. Alaric looked at the fire. He thought about the torches on the hill, the quiet of his farm, the sudden, inexplicable certainty that had moved him. How could he explain it when he did not understand it himself? "You were hurt," he said. It was the only answer he had. She watched him for a long moment, then, with a pained grunt, pushed herself up into a sitting position, her back against the stone base of the hearth. She picked up the bowl of stew. She did not eat it. She smelled it first. A long, deep inhale, her eyes never leaving him. Satisfied, she began to eat, slowly, methodically. He took that as a sign of trust, or at least a temporary truce. He moved to his stool in the corner, picked up a piece of leather and his awl, and began to work on mending a strap for a harness. The familiar motions calmed him. The cottage was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was filled with the soft sounds of her eating, the crackle of the fire, and the steady beat of the rain outside. It was a fragile, tense quiet, a silence that listened. Suddenly, a sharp, frantic knocking echoed from the door. It was not the casual rap of a lost traveller. It was desperate. The orc woman was on her feet in an instant. The bowl dropped, the blanket cast aside. The speed of it shocked him. One moment she was a wounded patient, the next a predator poised to strike. She grabbed the fire poker, holding it like a short sword. Her amber eyes flashed at him, then to the door. A silent command, a question. Alaric felt a spike of fear, cold and sharp. His safe world was shattering piece by piece. His first instinct was to shake his head, to refuse. But he had already crossed that line. He had brought her in. He was part of this now. He gave a short, jerky nod and moved to the door, his hand resting on the iron latch. He eased it open a crack. 2 more orc women stood on his doorstep, drenched and bleeding. They were younger than the first, their faces masks of desperation and exhaustion. One clutched a deep wound on her arm. The other leaned heavily on her companion, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. They saw him, and their expressions hardened, hands flying to the hilts of their crude axes. Before they could act, the orc woman inside his cottage spoke a single sharp word in their guttural tongue. They froze. Their eyes flickered past him to her, and a flicker of disbelief, then relief, crossed their faces. The first orc, the leader, he now realized, gave a curt nod toward him, an order. Let them in. Alaric opened the door wider. He felt a grim, situational irony wash over him. An hour ago, his greatest concern had been a leaking gutter. Now, he was running a field hospital for a fugitive orc warband. He stepped back as the 2 newcomers staggered inside, their armor clanking softly. The one with the broken leg collapsed onto the floor with a strangled cry of pain. The leader barked another order. The one with the wounded arm immediately moved to her fallen comrade's side. The leader herself, despite her own fresh stitches, knelt to examine the leg. Her movements were clinical, efficient. She looked at the twisted limb, then up at Alaric. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze was pointed. She needed help. He felt a weary resignation settle over him. He was already damned. What was one more soul to save? "Bring her to the table," he said, his voice flat. "And for God's sake, try not to bleed on the good chairs." He wasn't sure why he said that last part. Maybe to pretend he still had some control over his own home. The 2 conscious orcs looked at each other, then at him. The leader translated his words with a few harsh syllables. The uninjured one grunted, and together they hauled their moaning companion onto Alaric's sturdy oak table, shoving aside his half-finished harness repair. The leg was bad. A clean break of the tibia, the bone threatening to push through the skin. Setting it would be agony. He looked at the orc woman on his table. Her face was pale green, beaded with sweat. She stared at the ceiling, her breath coming in ragged pants. Alaric went to his stores. He came back with 2 flat, sturdy pieces of wood he used for splitting shingles and more linen strips. He also brought a small leather pouch. He handed it to the leader. "Give her this to bite on," he said. The leader took the pouch, looked at it, then at him. She didn't ask what it was for. She understood. She wedged it between the injured orc's teeth. Then she and the other warrior took hold of the injured one's shoulders, pinning her to the table. They looked at him. Ready. Alaric took a deep breath. He gripped the orc's ankle with one hand and her calf with the other. "This is going to be loud," he muttered to himself. He pulled. A scream, muffled by the leather pouch, tore through the cottage. The orc on the table arched her back, her entire body rigid with pain. Alaric ignored it, focusing on the feel of the bone. He pulled hard and straight, then, with a sharp, practiced twist, felt the ends of the bone grind and then slot back into place. He worked quickly then, his hands a blur as he placed the splints on either side of her leg and began wrapping them tightly with the linen strips. The injured orc went limp, her head falling to the side, unconscious from the pain. He finished his work and stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The cottage was silent again, save for the fire and the rain. The 2 conscious orcs were staring at him. The hostility was gone from their eyes. In its place was something else, something that looked suspiciously like respect. The leader walked over to him. She was his height, but seemed to tower over him. She looked at his hands, then at his face. She pointed a finger at her own chest. "Griska," she said. Her voice was still rough, but the grinding edge was gone. He understood. A name, an offering. "Alaric," he replied, his own voice quiet. She nodded once, a sharp, formal gesture. Then she turned away and went to check on her soldiers. The unspoken truce had solidified. He was no longer just a potential threat or a temporary convenience. He was something else. An ally, perhaps. A neutral party who had, for his own strange reasons, chosen a side. He looked around his small cottage, now crowded with 3 wounded orc warriors. His stew pot was empty. His floor was tracked with mud and blood. His home had been invaded. And yet, for the first time in 10 years, it did not feel empty. It felt full of a dangerous, uncertain, but vibrant life. He had a feeling his quiet days were over. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm, a routine of fragile domesticity layered over a constant, humming tension. Alaric would rise before dawn, as he always had, and find Grishka awake, sitting silently by the banked embers of the fire. She rarely seemed to sleep. Her amber eyes would follow him as he moved about the small cottage, stoking the flames, putting water on to boil. Her 2 warriors, whose names he learned were Chela and Vorga, were recovering. Vorga, the one with the broken leg, was confined to a pallet of straw and blankets Alaric had set up in the warmest corner of the room. Chela's arm was healing cleanly, and she quickly proved restless. On the 3rd day, Alaric woke to the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of an axe splitting wood outside. He looked out his small window to see Chela, her injured arm held stiffly at her side, efficiently working her way through his woodpile with his spare axe. She worked with a grim determination, as if attacking the wood was a substitute for attacking an enemy. He had intended to spend the morning splitting that wood. He watched her for a moment, then turned back to the hearth without a word. It was a contribution, a payment. He understood the language of work. Griska contributed in her own way. She did not perform chores. Her role was clearly that of a leader. She was the watcher, the guardian. While he worked in the barn, mending tools or checking his meager stores, she would often stand in the doorway, her gaze fixed on the tree line, the fire poker never far from her hand. She was a coiled spring, a storm cloud waiting to break. Her presence changed the very air of his farm, charging it with a sense of purpose and danger. They spoke little. Language was a barrier, but more than that, they were both creatures of silence. Their communication happened in gestures and actions. When he rebandaged Vorga's leg, Griska would watch his hands, her expression intense, as if memorizing the process. When he returned from checking his snares, empty-handed and grim, he found a brace of rabbits, cleaned and skinned, lying on his doorstep. Keller had evidently been hunting. One evening, a deep chill had set into the cottage. The fire was burning low, and he was exhausted from a long day of reinforcing the fence line. He had fallen asleep in his chair, a rare indulgence. When he woke hours later, the moon was high and the cottage was cold. He shivered and got up to add more logs to the fire, only to find the blanket from his own bed carefully draped over his shoulders. He looked over at the 3 sleeping orcs. Griska was nearest the fire, her breathing deep and even for once. She had woken in the cold and thought to cover him. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but it landed in his chest with a surprising weight. It was an act of care, reciprocal, unasked for. He stood there for a long time in the quiet dark, the rough wool of the blanket a warm weight on his shoulders. The next night, as they sat around the fire, the silence felt different, less tense, more companionable. Vorga was sitting up now, carving a piece of wood with a small knife, her splintered leg stretched out before her. Killa was sharpening her axe with a whetstone Alaric had given her. The rhythmic shk-shk of the stone on steel was a peaceful sound. "This farm," Griska said, her voice startling him out of his reverie. She spoke the common tongue slowly, deliberately, as if the words were unfamiliar shapes in her mouth. "It was your father's." Alaric shook his head, his gaze on the flames. "No, it was my wife's." The sharpening sound stopped. Keller and Vorga were looking at him. Griska's amber eyes were steady on his face. "I was a tanner's apprentice in the valley," he continued, the words coming out easier than he expected. It had been years since he had spoken of this to anyone. "Met Alara at a market day. Her father owned this land. He didn't think I was good enough for her." He gave a small, humorless smile. He was probably right, but she was stubborn. He paused, the memories rising like ghosts. "We had a daughter, Lyra. She had her mother's smile." He stared into the fire, seeing faces in the embers. Then the red cough came through the valley, 10 years ago. It took them both in a week. Alara's father was already gone. There was no one else. So I stayed. The work is honest, and it is quiet. He fell silent. He had not meant to say so much. The confession left him feeling hollowed out, exposed. Grizka watched him, her expression unreadable as stone. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a nod of pity. It was a nod of understanding, a recognition of loss. "My clan is Blood Tusk," she said, her voice a low rumble. "My father is chieftain, or he was." She looked down at her hands. "My cousin, Korgul, desires the chieftain's seat. He believes my father is weak, too willing to trade with humans, too willing to seek peace." Her hand clenched into a fist. "He whispered poison in the ears of the warriors. He promised them glory, conquest, old ways." She looked up, and her eyes were like burning coals. "He ambushed us on a patrol, called us traitors. My father's honor guard fought. They fought well. Keller, Vorga, and I were the only ones to escape. Betrayal, high status, it all clicked into place. She was not just a random warrior. She was a political fugitive, a noble in exile. The danger he was in suddenly sharpened, its edges becoming clearer and more lethal. The men who hunted her were not simple bandits. They were politically motivated. They would not give up easily. He felt a new kind of fear, different from the initial shock. It was a cold, calculating dread. He had harbored a chieftain's daughter. He had chosen a side in a war he knew nothing about. "Lady, if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this," he found himself saying, the words a dry rasp. It was a profoundly stupid thing to say, but it was the truth. He had no power, no influence, no secret skills to help a warrior princess. He was just a farmer. Grizka looked at him, a strange expression on her face. It might have been the firelight, but he thought he saw the corner of her mouth twitch. "You have your own strength, Alaric the tanner," she said, the name sounding strange and formal. "You mend what is broken." The fragile thaw between them had deepened. It was no longer a truce born of necessity, but a bond forged in shared wounds and quiet confessions. He had seen a glimpse of the woman behind the warrior, and she had seen the man behind the solitude. But in that sharing, the stakes had been raised impossibly high. Her fight was now his fight, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the fight was coming to his door. The first sign came 3 days later. It was nothing more than a broken branch on the path leading from the woods, and a single deep boot print in the mud beside it. Not his boot, and too large for a human. An orc. But it was not the print of Grizka or her warriors. Their boots were worn in specific ways he had come to recognize. This was new. A scout. Alaric said nothing, but when he returned to the cottage, the grim set of his jaw was enough. Grizka met his eyes across the room, and a silent understanding passed between them. The hunt had resumed. The peace was over. That afternoon she gathered her warriors. Vorga was now able to stand, leaning heavily on a crude crutch Alaric had fashioned for her. Grizka spoke to them in their own tongue, her voice low and urgent. Alaric watched from the barn, pretending to sharpen a scythe blade. He saw the grim nods, the way Kila's hand tightened on her axe. They were preparing for a fight. He went back to his work, but his mind was racing. His farm was not a fortress. It was a collection of wooden buildings and fences designed to keep sheep in, not orc warriors out. But it was his land. He knew every dip and swell of the earth, every ditch, every weak spot in the fence, every tree that offered a clear line of sight. That knowledge was his only weapon. That evening he approached Grizka as she stood her watch by the barn. The sun was setting, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of blood and rust. "They will come from the north," he said, not bothering with a preamble. "Through the woods, the tree cover is thickest there." She turned to him, her face a stoic mask in the fading light. "We know. The fence is weak by the old oak," he continued, pointing. "They'll think it's an easy way through. But the ground there is soft. It turns to deep mud after a rain. It will slow them down." A flicker of interest in her eyes. "Show me." For the next hour, as dusk deepened into night, he walked her around the perimeter of his farm. He was no general, no tactician. He was a farmer. He spoke of the land in practical terms. He showed her the irrigation ditch he had dug, deep enough to break a leg in the dark. He pointed out the woodpile, stacked high against the barn, that could be toppled to create a barrier. He showed her the hayloft door, a perfect perch for an archer, if they had one. She listened intently, her gaze sharp, taking in every detail. She asked few questions, but he could see her mind working, translating his farmer's knowledge into a warrior's strategy. Keller followed them, a silent, menacing shadow. "Here," Alaric said, stopping by the main gate to the yard. "The latch is iron, but the post is old. A strong shoulder could break it." "We will reinforce it," Keller grunted. "No," Grizka said, her voice sharp. She ran a hand over the weathered wood of the post. "We leave it. An invitation." She looked at Alaric. "Where does it lead?" "Straight into the yard," he said. "A kill zone." He hadn't realized he was thinking in those terms until he said the words. The space between the barn and the cottage, where he had spent countless hours, was now a calculated patch of death. Grizka nodded, a grim smile touching her lips for the first time. Good. They did not have to wait long. The attack came just before dawn, under the cover of a thick fog that had rolled down from the foothills. Alaric was awake, sitting by the fire, a woodsman's axe across his lap. He felt clumsy and foolish holding it, but the weight was reassuring. The first sound was a splintering crack. The gatepost, just as they had planned. Instantly, the cottage was a hive of activity. Kayla was already out the back door, melting into the fog toward the pre-planned ambush point by the ditch. Vorga, her leg still a hindrance, took up a position by the window. A heavy crossbow Alaric had kept in storage resting on the sill. It was old, and the string was stiff, but it was powerful. Grizka stood in the center of the room, a sword in each hand. They were not the crude axes of her warriors. They were fine, balanced weapons, their steel gleaming in the firelight. He had not seen them before. She must have had them hidden. "Stay inside," she commanded him, her voice like a drawn blade. "Bar the door." Then she was gone, slipping out the front door into the swirling grey mist. Alaric's heart hammered against his ribs. He moved to the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. He felt useless, trapped. His part of the plan was over. Now he could only wait and listen. He heard a shout from the yard, quickly cut off, then a scream of pain, the wet, heavy thud of an axe finding its mark, a roar of fury in the orc tongue, followed by the high, sharp ring of steel on steel. Grizka was engaged. He crept to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. He could see shapes moving in the fog, fleeting and monstrous. He saw Hela burst from behind the woodpile, her axe a whirlwind of motion, felling one attacker before another turned on her. He saw Grizka, a whirlwind of death between two larger orcs, her twin blades a blur, parrying, thrusting, dancing a lethal ballet. A crossbow bolt thwacked into the wall just beside the window. Vorga cursed from her position, cranking the stiff loading mechanism of her own crossbow.
"They are trying to flank the barn,"
she yelled, her voice strained. Alaric knew that path. It was narrow between the barn and the stone wall that marked his small garden, a bottleneck. An idea, desperate and stupid, sparked in his mind. "Keep her busy," he shouted to Vorga, not knowing if she understood. He unbolted the door, grabbed a lit oil lamp from the mantel and ran outside. The air was cold and filled with the coppery scent of blood. The sounds of combat were deafeningly close. He ignored them, sprinting for the barn. He scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, his boots slipping on the rungs. He peered out the hayloft door. Below him, just as Vorga had said, 3 orc warriors were trying to creep along the narrow path beside the barn, hoping to attack Grizka from behind. They were moving cautiously, their eyes fixed on the fight in the main yard. They hadn't seen him. Alaric's hands were shaking. He looked at the oil lamp, then at the tons of dry hay packed into the loft. It was his winter feed for the sheep, his livelihood. He thought of Grizka, fighting for her life in his yard. He thought of her placing the blanket over him in the night. He opened the lamp's cover. He didn't just drop it, he swung it, sending a high, glittering arc of burning oil down onto the attackers. It wasn't a fireball, not like in the stories, but it was enough. The oil splattered across the back and shoulders of the lead orc. He screamed as his leather armor and hair caught fire. He dropped his weapon, clawing at his back, and stumbled blindly into his companions. They were thrown into chaos. One tried to beat out the flames on his comrade. The other looked up, roaring in fury, and saw Alaric in the hayloft. He raised his axe to throw it. A crossbow bolt sprouted from his throat. He gurgled, dropped his axe, and fell. Vorga had made the shot. The first orc, still burning, had blundered out into the main yard, a screaming torch of a creature. The distraction was total. Grizka seized the moment. With a final brutal flurry of strikes, she dispatched the warrior she was fighting. Hela, her face a mask of blood and mud, buried her axe in the back of another. The last remaining attacker, seeing his comrades fall and one of them on fire, broke. He turned and fled back into the fog, disappearing into the woods. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning orc and the ragged gasps of the survivors. Alaric slid down the ladder, his legs trembling. He walked out into the yard. The ground was churned to mud and stained with dark patches. 4 bodies lay twisted on the ground. His ground. Chela was leaning on her axe, breathing heavily. Vorga was already hobbling out of the cottage. Grizka stood in the middle of it all, her swords dripping. Her eyes found his. She looked at the smouldering body, then back at him in the hayloft door. There was no praise in her expression, no thanks, just a long, searching look, an assessment. He had done more than just stay inside and bar the door. He had fought. In his own way, he had fought, and in doing so, he had tied his fate to hers with a knot of blood and fire that could never be undone. He had destroyed a portion of his livelihood to save her. The quiet farmer was gone, burned away with the lamp oil. A different man stood in his place, covered in soot and smelling of smoke, his heart still hammering with a terrible, vibrant fear. The aftermath of the fight was a grim, silent affair. Alaric and Keller dragged the bodies into the woods, leaving them for the crows and the wolves. No words were exchanged. The work was heavy, the reality of what had happened settling upon them like a shroud. Alaric felt a numbness creep over him as he handled the dead weight of the orcs who had tried to kill him. They were just like Grizka, only on the other side of a line drawn by ambition and betrayal. Back at the farm, the air was thick with unspoken things. Vorga cleaned and reloaded her crossbow. Grizka cleaned her twin swords, her movements precise and detached. Alaric went to the well, the bucket rope coarse against his raw hands, and began the long task of washing the blood from his yard. He scrubbed at the dark stains on the earth, as if he could wash away the entire morning, as if he could restore his farm to what it had been, a place of peace. But the scent of death clung to the air, a ghost that would not be exorcised. He felt a profound sense of loss, not for the dead orcs, but for his home. It was tainted now. The hayloft where he had slept as a boy on hot summer nights was now a sniper's nest. The yard where his daughter had taken her first steps was now a battlefield. He was a stranger in his own life. That night, no one spoke. The 4 of them sat around the fire, each lost in their own thoughts. The space between them was no longer just quiet. It was heavy with the weight of shared violence. He had thought the bond between them was forged in care and confession. He saw now it was tempered in blood. The next day, a new arrival shattered the grim quiet. It was not an attack. A lone orc, young and wiry, stumbled out of the woods. He was not armed for a fight, carrying only a small pack. Keller had her axe to his throat before he was 10 paces from the cottage. "Wait," Grizka commanded, stepping out onto the porch. The young orc fell to one knee, bowing his head. He spoke in a rush of guttural orcish, his voice filled with panic and reverence. Alaric could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of bad news. Grizka listened, her face hardening into a mask of cold fury. When the young orc finished, she asked a single, sharp question. He answered, his head still bowed. Then she turned, and her amber eyes found Alaric. The look in them was one he had never seen before. It was a vortex of rage, grief, and something that looked like shame. "My father is dead," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was more chilling than any shout. "Corgil named himself chieftain of the Blood Tusk. He declared my father a weak-hearted traitor for trading with your kind. She took a step toward him, and he has declared me outlaw. Me, and any who shelter me. There is a bounty on my head, and on yours." The world tilted. A bounty on his head, because he had pulled a wounded woman out of the mud. The sheer, staggering injustice of it stole his breath. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, followed by a wave of cold, profound hurt. But it was the next words that broke him. The young messenger, still kneeling, looked up at Griska and spoke again, this time pointing a trembling finger at Alaric. He said something that included the word human and Corgil. Griska's jaw tightened. "He says Corgil is telling the clan that I have fled to my human lover," she translated, her voice laced with self-disgust. "That I have betrayed my people for a soft, pink-skinned farmer." Betrayal. The word hit him like a physical blow. He looked at her, at this warrior princess, this chieftain's daughter, and all he had seen was a person in need. He had offered his home, his skills, his safety. He had taken up arms for her, and in her world, his kindness was being twisted into a weapon against her. He was not an ally. He was a disgrace, a liability, a stain on her honor. He felt like a fool. A simple, naive fool who had stumbled into a game played by kings and warriors, thinking his simple decency was a currency they would recognize. He had felt seen by her, this powerful woman who acknowledged his quiet strength. Now he felt used. He was just a place to hide, a convenient narrative for her enemy. Their connection, the fragile thing they had built by the fire with shared stories and quiet acts of care, felt like a lie. "So that's what I am to you?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A place to hide, a weakness for your cousin to exploit?" Griska flinched as if he had struck her. "No," she said, her voice a low growl. "That is what Corgil makes of you. That is the poison he spreads." "And what am I, Griska?" he pressed, the name feeling like ash in his mouth. "What am I to you?" She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For the first time since he had met her, the formidable Griska, daughter of the chieftain, was speechless. The truth of his question hung between them, devastating and unanswerable. Before she could find her voice, the young messenger cried out again, pointing frantically back toward the woods. Torches. Not 3 or 4 this time. Dozens. An army. They were not creeping or scouting. They were advancing, a line of fire and steel sweeping down the hill. Corgil had not sent another small party. He had come himself. The final siege had begun. "Into the cottage!" Griska roared, her personal pain instantly buried under the iron will of a commander. "Forga, the windows. Keller, the back. Messenger, you fight with me." The young orc scrambled to his feet, drawing a short, wicked-looking knife. Alaric just stood there, frozen in the yard. The torches came closer, resolving into the shapes of armored orcs, their weapons glinting. He could hear their war cries now, a deep, baying roar that shook the very air. They were coming to burn him out, to kill him and the woman he had saved. His home. They were going to destroy his home because of a choice he had made in the rain. A flaming arrow arced high and slammed into the thatched roof of his cottage. It smoked for a moment, then, with a soft whoosh, the dry thatch caught fire. The sight broke his paralysis. A cold, calm rage settled over him. They were not just attacking Grizka, they were burning his wife's house. They were burning his daughter's memory. They were trying to erase the last 10 years of his life. He turned and walked back into the barn, his face set like stone. He did not grab his axe. He walked past the tools, past the ladder to the loft. He went to a dark corner, covered by a heavy canvas sheet. He pulled the sheet away, revealing an old, dusty travelling chest. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a sword. It was not a farmer's tool. It was a soldier's longsword, well balanced, its leather-wrapped hilt worn smooth with use. It had been his father's, a man-at-arms who had died long before Alaric had ever thought of being a tanner. He had kept it, a relic of a life he never wanted. He drew the blade. The steel was still good, cared for out of a sense of duty he never examined. He was not a swordsman. He had had a few lessons as a boy, long forgotten, but it was better than an axe. It felt right. He walked out of the barn and into the chaos. The yard was a swirling melee. Grizka and Keller were fighting back to back near the burning cottage, a small island of defiance in a sea of enemies. Vorga was firing bolts from the window, but already orcs were at the walls, trying to break down the door. Alaric saw him then, a massive orc, larger than the rest, wearing ornate iron plate armor and carrying a huge, double-bladed axe. He stood behind the line of his warriors, directing the attack with sharp commands. Korgul. His face was a mask of arrogant cruelty. Alaric began to walk toward him, the sword held loosely at his side. He was not a warrior. He was a dead man. But he would die on his feet. He would die defending the last piece of his world. An orc warrior saw him and broke away from the main fight, charging him with a roar. He was younger, faster, stronger. Alaric stood his ground. He remembered one thing his father had taught him. Let the enemy's rage be his weakness. The orc swung his club in a wide, powerful arc meant to cave in Alaric's skull. Alaric didn't try to block it. At the last second, he stepped inside the swing and thrust his sword, not with skill, but with all his weight, straight into the orc's unprotected gut. The orc gasped, his eyes wide with surprise. He stumbled back, clutching the sword buried in his belly, and fell. Alaric stood over him, weaponless, his hands empty. Another warrior was already turning toward him. This was it. But then Grizka was there. She had seen him. She had seen him kill one of Korgul's warriors. She had seen him choose to stand and fight. She broke away from Keller, leaving her warrior to hold the line, and charged through the battle to stand at his side. An enemy lunged, and she cut him down without a second glance. She stood before him, her back to his chest, shielding him. The flames from the cottage roof lit her face, casting her in flickering shades of orange and red. battle raged around them, a storm of steel and shouting. But in that small space, there was a strange, terrible calm.
"Corgal!"
she bellowed, her voice cutting across the clearing like iron breaking. The fighting faltered. Warriors on both sides looked toward her. Even Corgal in the back turned his full attention to her.
"You name me outlaw,"
she shouted, her voice ringing with power and authority.
"You name me traitor. You say I lie with a human to shame my bloodline."
She reached back, her hand finding Alaric's. Her grip was strong, her calluses rough against his. She pulled him forward so he was standing beside her, facing Corgal and his army. He still had no weapon. He was just a man in a homespun tunic, standing next to a warrior queen.
"I do not lie with him,"
Grizka declared, her voice echoing in the sudden silence.
"I stand with him. I choose him. This man, Alaric, has more honor in his hands than you have in your entire black heart. He is my mate, and he will stand beside me as I take back my father's clan."
It was not a confession of love. It was a declaration of war, a political act of supreme defiance. She was not just accepting him, she was elevating him, using her choice of him as a weapon against her enemy. She was answering his question from before. What am I to you? This. He was this. Corgal stared, his face contorted with disbelief, then rage.
"A human,"
he spat, his voice dripping with contempt.
"You shame our ancestors. You will die with your pink-skinned pet."
He raised his great axe.
"Kill them both," he roared. "Burn it all to the ground."
The battle erupted again, fiercer than before. But something had shifted. Grizka threw one of her swords to Alaric. The hilt slapped into his palm, a perfect fit. "Then stand," she said to him, her voice low, meant only for him. It was not a plea or a command. It was a statement of fact, a shared destiny. He stood. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and desperation. Alaric was no swordsman, but he had the reach of the longsword and a cold, clear purpose. He was not trying to win. He was trying to survive the next second and the one after that. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Grizka, her movements fluid and deadly beside his own stiff, awkward defense. They were a strange pair, the graceful warrior and the stubborn farmer, moving as one. Keller, Vorga, and the young messenger formed a tight semicircle with them, a tiny island of loyalty against a tide of hate. His cottage was an inferno now, the roof collapsing inward with a great roar, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. The heat was intense, the smoke acrid. Everything he had owned, every physical trace of his past life, was turning to ash. He felt a pang of grief, sharp and deep, but it was immediately consumed by the fire of the battle. There was no time for mourning. There was only the next swing of an axe to parry, the next enemy to face. Corgal, seeing his warriors falter against the desperate, inspired defense, finally lost his patience. With a roar of fury, he pushed through his own men and charged forward,
his massive axe held high. He was coming for Grizka. Kella threw herself in his path. She was half his size, but her courage was absolute. She met his charge with her own, her axe swinging. The sound of their weapons clashing was like a thunderclap. Korgel was stronger. He drove her back, his blows raining down, forcing her to give ground. With a final, brutal swing, he shattered her axe handle and sent her stumbling to her knees. He raised his axe for the killing blow.
"No!" Grizka screamed and tried to push past the orcs engaging her, but Alaric was closer. He did not think, he reacted. He lunged forward, not at Korgel, but at the ground in front of him. He threw his body into a clumsy, rolling tackle, slamming into Korgel's legs. It was a brawler's move, not a swordsman's. It was the move of a desperate farmer. The huge orc, caught off balance, bellowed in surprise and crashed to the ground, his axe flying from his grasp. Alaric scrambled back to his feet, but Korgel was faster. He rose with a snarl, discarding his lost axe and drawing a wicked-looking dagger from his belt. He was between Alaric and Grizka. He lunged, not for the disarmed Kella, but for the human who had humbled him. Alaric brought his sword up, but he was too slow. Korgel's charge was too fast. The chieftain was going to gut him. A crossbow bolt slammed into Korgel's shoulder. It did not stop him, but it made him grunt in pain and check his stride for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Grizka was there. She drove her sword through the gap in Korgel's armor, under his arm, and into his heart. Korgel froze. His eyes went wide with shock. He looked down at the blade protruding from his chest, then up at his cousin. He opened his mouth, a bloody gurgle escaping his lips. Then he collapsed, his heavy plate armor crashing to the ground. The death of their leader broke the attack completely. The remaining warriors stared at Korgel's body, then at Grizka, who stood over him, her face a mask of grim victory. Some lowered their weapons. Others simply turned and fled into the darkness. The battle was over. Silence fell, broken by the roar of the fire and the groans of the wounded. Alaric stood panting, his borrowed sword feeling impossibly heavy. His body ached, and his knuckles were bleeding. He looked at the burning ruin of his home. It was gone. Everything was gone. Grizka walked over to him, her face smudged with soot and blood. She looked at the fire, then at him. Her expression was impossible to read. "You have nothing left here," she said. It was a simple statement of fact. "No," he agreed, his voice hoarse. She held out her hand. It was not a gesture of command or of pity. It was an invitation, an offer between equals. "My home is gone," he said, looking at her hand but not taking it. "I will not be a guest in yours. I will not be your pet for other orcs to mock." "I did not offer you a cage," she said, her voice soft. "I offered you a place at my side. I chose you, Alaric, before my clan, before my enemies. I chose." He looked into her amber eyes, seeing past the warrior, past the chieftain's daughter. He saw the woman who had let him stitch her wounds, who had covered him with a blanket, who had stood with him in the fire. He had lost his quiet life, his home, his past. But in the ashes, something new had been offered. A purpose, a partner, a future he never could have imagined. He took her hand. Her grip was firm, her skin warm. "Then we should go," he said. "We are burning the daylight." Together they turned their backs on the smoking ruins of his past and walked toward the dark line of the woods, toward her future. Kella, her arm broken but her spirit intact, and Vorga, leaning on her crutch, and the young messenger fell in behind them, a small, broken clan, walking away from a victory that felt like a defeat, heading toward a war that was far from over. The journey back to the Blood Tusk Mountain stronghold was a hard, grim march. They moved through the wilder parts of the foothills, avoiding main paths and crossroads. Alaric, who had not been more than 5 miles from his farm in a decade, found himself in a world of harsh, breathtaking beauty and constant, gnawing danger. He was clumsy on the rocky trails, his farmer's boots unsuited for the terrain. He was a liability, and he knew it. But he learned. He watched how Kella tested the ground before putting her weight down, how Vorga used her crutch as a third point of contact on steep descents. He learned to be quiet, to listen to the forest, to read the signs of animal trails that could mean fresh water or a predator's territory. He learned the taste of wild roots and the surprising nourishment in roasted insects. He was shedding his old self, layer by layer, like a snake sheds its skin. The orcs treated him with a detached, professional distance. He was Grizka's chosen, and her word was law. But he was still an outsider, a fragile, soft-skinned creature who did not know how to hunt, or fight, or navigate by the stars. Kella, especially, watched him with a critical eye, her expression making it clear she found him wanting. One evening, as he struggled to start a fire with damp wood, his hands clumsy and cold, Kella shoved him aside with a grunt of impatience. She took his flint and steel, and with a few expert strikes and a puff of breath into a tinder bundle she produced from her pouch, had a small, smokeless fire going in moments. She gave him a look of profound disdain and walked away. He felt a familiar sting of inadequacy, but instead of shame, he felt a cold spark of determination. That night, while the others slept, he practiced, striking the flint and steel over and over until his knuckles were raw, learning the feel of it, the angle needed to cast the hottest spark. When they reached the hidden entrance to the Blood Tusk clan hold, a massive cave system honeycombed into the heart of a mountain, they were met with open hostility. Grizka's return, with Korgul's head carried by the young messenger as proof of her victory, had thrown the clan into turmoil. Korgul's faction was still strong, and they viewed Grizka's claim with suspicion, and they viewed Alaric with undisguised contempt. He was a human, a farmer, the pink-skinned pet of Korgul's propaganda. As they walked through the great cavern, lit by massive torches, the whispers followed them. Orcs stopped their work at forges and tanning racks to stare, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disgust. He could feel the weight of hundreds of hostile eyes on him. He kept his gaze forward, his hand near the hilt of the sword Grizka had given him, though he knew it would do him little good here.
Grizka, now in her element, was transformed. She walked with an authority and presence that demanded respect. She met every challenge, every shouted question from the clan elders with a steady voice and unshakable confidence. She told the story of Corgo's betrayal, of her father's murder, and of her victory. She presented the head of her cousin to the council, a final, brutal proof. But the matter of Alaric was a sticking point. You would lead us, yet you bring this thing into our hall? Demanded a grizzled old warrior on the council, his face a web of scars. He is a human, a weakness. Corgel was right about that. He is not a weakness, he is my chosen, Grizka stated, her voice ringing in the vast cavern. His heart is stronger than Corgel's ever was. He stood when others would have fled. He is a farmer, the elder spat. What can he do? Plow the stone floors of our mountain? Sing songs to the sheep? A wave of harsh laughter echoed through the hall. Alaric stood beside Grizka, his face burning. He felt small and useless, a living symbol of her supposed folly. He saw the doubt in the eyes of some of her potential allies. This was the true battle, not the one fought with swords on his farm, but the one fought with words and prejudice in this hall of stone. For days he was isolated, given a small, cold alcove to sleep in, and barely edible scraps of food. He was a pariah. He saw Grizka only in passing, as she was constantly locked in council meetings and political maneuvering, fighting to solidify her claim. He knew that his presence was hurting her chances. He could leave, slip away in the night. It would make her life easier. But he had taken her hand. He had accepted the place at her side. To flee now would be to prove her enemies right. It would be a betrayal of the stand they had taken together in the fire. So he stayed, and he worked. He saw the state of the clan's equipment. Their leather straps were cracked and dry. The hafts of their axes were splintered. Their armor was ill-maintained, the metal rusted in places. Generations of focusing on warfare had let the simple, practical crafts atrophy. He went to the clan's quartermaster, a hulking orc with a sour expression, and, using the few words of Orcish he had picked up and a great deal of pantomime, asked for scraps of leather, a dull knife, and a place to work. The quartermaster grunted and waved him toward a pile of discarded hides. Alaric spent the next day doing what he knew. He found the right stones to sharpen the knife. He used grease from the cooking pits to soften and treat the old leather. He cut it into precise strips. He found discarded bits of sinew and braided them into strong cord. By the end of the day, he had crafted a set of new, supple, and incredibly strong replacement straps for a warrior's pauldron. He found Kayla, who had been avoiding him since their arrival, and held them out to her. She looked at the straps, then at him, her expression suspicious. She took them, turning them over in her hands. She tested their strength, pulling on them with all her might. They held. She examined the stitching, the clean cuts, the way the leather was perfectly conditioned. It was good work. Better than good. It was master-level craft. She grunted, a sound of grudging approval, and walked away without a word. But the next day another warrior came to him, holding out a broken shield strap and looking at him expectantly. Alaric worked. He claimed a small forgotten corner of the great cavern as his own. He built a crude workbench. He repaired tools.
He rewrapped sword hilts. He tanned new hides with an efficiency and skill they had never seen. He did not speak much. He just worked, his hands moving with a quiet, steady competence. He was not a warrior, he was a craftsman, and he was showing them a different kind of strength. The strength to make, to mend, to build. The laughter and open contempt began to fade, replaced by a grudging respect. They still called him the human, but the sneer was gone from the word. They started bringing him their best cuts of meat, their warmest furs. He was no longer a pet. He was a resource. He was becoming a part of the clan, not through blood, but through the work of his hands. Weeks later, Grizka finally won her struggle. The clan council, swayed by her leadership and seeing the practical value Alaric brought, officially recognized her as the Blood Tusk chieftain. A great celebration was planned. The night before the ceremony, she came to his small alcove. It was the first time they had been truly alone since arriving. He had been working late, finishing a new, perfectly balanced handle for Kella's replacement axe. "The council has accepted me," she said, her voice quiet. "I heard," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Congratulations, chieftain." The title felt strange between them. "They have also accepted you," she said. "They have offered you a place in the warrior lodge to learn the axe." He stopped his work then and looked up at her. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the weight of her new responsibility. "I am not a warrior, Grizka. I am a tanner, a farmer, a mender of things." "I know," she said. She stepped closer into the small circle of light cast by his lamp. "That is why I chose you." She was holding something, a piece of armor, a steel gorget intricately carved with the clan's sigil. It was part of the chieftain's ceremonial regalia. The leather strap that held it together was frayed and old. "It was my father's," she said, holding it out to him. "The strap is weak. Can you fix it?" He took the piece of armor. The steel was cold and heavy in his hands. He looked at the worn leather strap, then back at her. It was a test and a symbol. She was not asking him to be a warrior. She was asking him to be himself. He nodded. "I can." He set aside Kella's axe and got to work. He did not rush. He chose the best piece of hide he had, a dark, supple piece of leather he had been saving. He cut a new strap, his knife moving with practiced ease. He beveled the edges, punched the holes for the buckle, and stitched it to the steel plates with strong, even stitches. When he was finished, he stood up. Grizka had not moved. She watched him, her expression soft in the lamplight. "Turn around," he said, his voice quiet. She turned, presenting her back to him. He stepped forward and lifted the heavy gorget. He settled it around her neck, the cold steel resting against her warm skin. His fingers brushed against her neck as he reached for the buckle. The same way he had once tended her wounds, a stranger in his cottage. But now there was no fear, no suspicion, only a deep, quiet intimacy, an earned trust. He fastened the buckle.
The new leather was strong and secure. It was a perfect fit. He let his hands rest on her shoulders for a moment. He had lost everything. His home, his past, his quiet life. But here, in the heart of a mountain, surrounded by warriors of a different race, he had found a new home, a new purpose. He had been seen not for what he lacked, but for what he was. And he had chosen to stand not behind, but beside.
She turned to face him, her hand coming up to touch the newly mended armor at her throat. Her amber eyes held his. "Tomorrow," she said, "I am named chieftain." "I know," he said. "You will stand with me," she stated. It was not a question. He smiled, a true smile, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I will."